Son, reconciling God and man, Christ our mighty champion. What a Savior, what a friend, what a glorious mystery. Once a babe, now the Lord of history. What a Savior, what a friend, what a glorious mystery. Once a babe in Bethlehem, now the Lord of history. Once a babe in Bethlehem, now the Lord of history. Christ, the Lord of history. No.
You saw last night.
Yes, Justin had to work. You had to remind me what it was.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. What did I do? Oh, I was
You
there.
didn't miss it.
That's right.
At least your body was there.
Right. I said, Kayla's today Wednesday.
That's a better day.
Do.
Well, good evening. Tonight, we're going to do something a little different. He said different. We're going to learn one of the songs that the choir sang on Sunday night. It is a modern Christmas hymn called "Joy Has Dawned," and if you're in choir, you already know it. So we're going to learn it tonight. It was written about 16 years ago by Keith Getty and Stuart Townend, and it's got some really rich lyrics that it was actually inserted into the Baptist hymnal in 2008, and it's one of my favorite Christmas hymns, and I think if you give it a chance, it might be yours too. So let's stand together and let's learn and sing together, "Joy Has Dawned." Joy has dawned upon the world, promise from creation, God's salvation now unfurled, hope for every nation, not with fanfares from above, not with scenes of glory, but a gift of love, Jesus born of Mary. Now you kind of got the hang of it. Let's sing verse 2. Sounds of wonder. Sounds of wonder fill the sky with the songs of angels as the mighty Prince of Life shelters in a stable. Hands that set each star in place, they shake the earth in darkness. Cling now to your mother's breast, vulnerable and helpless. Shepherds bow before the Lamb, gazing at the glory. Gifts among from distant lands prophesy the story. Gold, a king is born today. Incense, God is with us. There his death make a way, by his blood awakens. Son of Adam, Son of God, given as a ransom, reconciling God and man, Christ our mighty champion. What a Savior, what a friend, what a glorious mystery, once a baby Bethlehem, now the Lord of history. What a Savior, what a friend, what a glorious mystery. Once a baby Bethlehem, now the Lord of history. Once a baby Bethlehem, now the Lord of history. Christ, the Lord of history. Amen. may be seated.
Well, thank you so much, Peyton and Linda. I feel like this is a completely different stage tonight with no chairs. Like 4 times as big as it normally is. So, of course, it looks like this because of our WEM program that'll be taking place tomorrow night at 6:30, which everybody's welcome to be a part of. Tonight, we're going to be in Genesis 18, beginning in verse 16, then going all the way through chapter 19. We're going to be looking at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And generally, when we think about Sodom and Gomorrah, we think about it as a story of judgment, and in particular, a story of judgment upon homosexuality. Normally, again, when we hear Sodom and Gomorrah, judgment upon homosexuality is normally where our minds go. And while those things are true, that's only part of the story. Really, this is a story about God's character, and in particular, as I'll show you in a second, God's righteousness and justice. Now, as I was studying this, my mind went to, you don't have to turn here, but 2 Corinthians 3:18, which Paul says, "And we all with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit." And so as we look at being transformed into one degree of glory to another, that's our desire. That's the process of sanctification, me becoming more like Christ each and every day, but it is a process. It's not like just instantaneously, poof, we're glorious as we should be. It's one degree of glory to another. And he says the way that that happens is through beholding the glory of the Lord. The more that I know the Lord, the more I'm going to become like the Lord. And so, as we are studying God's word, which God gave us to make us competent and equipped for every good work, I need to make sure that as I'm studying this, I'm beholding the glory of the Lord in the word. Now, certainly, we do need to look at this and also say, what does this passage teach me about myself? What are the commands that I need to be obeying? What are the things that God tells me not to do? What does he tell me to do? And so, yes, I'm looking for all of those things. But if I'm not finding what those things are telling me about God, then all of that is for naught. If I'm just finding his commands and never beholding the glory of the Lord, I'm just becoming a Pharisee. And so as I'm seeking to become more obedient, as I'm seeking to learn about myself, I'm doing those things from beholding the glory of the Lord as shown in Scripture. So as we're going throughout the book of Genesis, I know that a lot of my sermons, all of them is just pointing out these attributes about God. What's this teaching us about God? It's because the more that I know God and the more I can behold his glory, the more I can become like him. The more I behold the glory, the more I can be transformed into that glory. And so, yes, there's things that we're going to talk about Lot tonight and Lot's sinfulness and how that relates to us, yet at the same time, the way that Lot rejects the commandments of the Lord teaches us about the Lord as well. And so there's both of those that are there. And as we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, are there things that we can take and apply to culture today? Yes, there is. But we can apply those to culture because it's the same God yesterday, today, and forever. And so as we look here at this story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we find a passage about God's righteousness and justice. And so if you're there with me in verse 16, now what's going on? There were 3 men, as we come to find out, there are 3 angels who had visited Abraham and Sarah, promised the birth of Isaac through who the covenant would be made and fulfilled. And then we pick up there after Isaac has been promised in verse 16. It says, "Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. So we pause right there, and again, God asks this question that is essentially, should I turn Abraham's gaze upon myself and give Abraham insight into what I'm about to do? Again, verse 18, seeing that I've just made this covenant with him, seeing that he's about to be the father of a great and mighty nation, seeing that through Abraham, all the nations of the world are going to learn about me. Should I give him insight into what I'm about to do? And then he goes on in verse 19 that I just read, for. Again, he's asking this question, not because he doesn't know, he's letting us in on his thought life. It says, for I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. Shall I let Abraham know what I am about to do? And of course, we know that he did. He tells Abraham what's about to happen, which leads to the exchange that they have in verses 22 through 33. But he says there that he does so that, according to verse 19, that Abraham may command all of his children to follow me. That was the means that God had desired for all the nations to become blessed through Abraham. Really, they're blessed through knowing God. It's just Abraham is that vehicle. How is he going to do that? Verse 19, by commanding his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord. He's going to pass down knowledge of God from one generation to another as that generation spreads out and covers the earth so that all peoples everywhere may know the glory of God. In light of the fact that that's going to happen, should I let him know? And the answer to that was yes. He's to command everybody about my righteousness and justice. And God's way of doing this is Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going, before Abraham begins this journey, before Isaac's even born, it's his job to make sure that everybody knows, so I'm going to give him a lesson. To make sure that he understands my righteousness and justice and can accurately teach the generations that are following him about that righteousness and justice. But before doing so, I guess this is in contrast to it, before bringing destruction, he shows other aspects of his righteousness and justice. And you see that in your outline, that God's righteousness and justice is then exemplified in several different ways in this passage to come. And I do want to point out here kind of a literary feature that Moses used as he wrote this is he bookended the story of Sodom and Gomorrah with God and Moses talking at Mamre. And one of the reasons in doing that is that draws our focus to that. He begins and he ends with a focus upon Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah being in the middle. So Sodom and Gomorrah isn't the focus. It's God's interaction with Abraham, and the middle of that is what Abraham learns about God. So first thing from verses 22 through 33 is that God is just. God is just. Now, we're going to read a lot in verse 19, but 22 through 33, I think a lot of you are familiar with that. It's where the angels told Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah, and then Abraham pleads with God, if there's 50 righteous people that are there, will you not destroy them? God says, sure. All right. What about 45? Sure. If there's 40, sure. And he goes on down and he goes on down, God being just, that I will not, let's see, for instance, 32. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. God is just. God was not going to destroy a righteous city. It's not like God one day and thought, you know what would be fun? Destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. That would be fun. That's how I'm going to use my infinite power today. Poof, destroyed. What Sodom and Gomorrah had coming to them, or what Sodom and Gomorrah got, was what they had coming to them. We reap what we sow. They lived in sin, and they were going to now reap what they had sowed. But God made clear, if there are righteous people there, I will not destroy it. God was not going to destroy the righteous. I think about 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. We're all going to stand judgment before God, and we are going to receive what is due for what we have done. Ezekiel 18, God makes a promise that he's not going to punish fathers for the sins of their sons, nor is he going to punish sons for the sins of their fathers. Rather, we will receive what we are due for what we have done. God is just in that the one who is guilty is the one who is punished. I believe the justice system in America is the greatest justice system that the world has ever known. And I think all of you understand along with me, that being true, how imperfect of a justice system we have. That there are guilty people for various reasons. Maybe they're really good at hiding it, or maybe the ones in the justice system are corrupt. But either way, there are guilty people who are walking free. Some of which, again, because they never caught anybody. Others because there's somebody who's innocent serving their time. Somebody else got blamed for what they did. They're guilty people walking free. And then we also know, unfortunately, there are innocent people in jail. We have the greatest justice system the world has ever known, yet it is incredibly imperfect. But the truth that we know about God is that God is perfectly just. The one who is guilty will serve the time. The one who is guilty will be the one who is punished. The one who is innocent will not face that wrath. There's lots of things that we can make with that. For one, we think about those in this life who have suffered at the hand of evil people. Whether it's through abuse or some other form or fashion, and we may look at it and say, how can these wicked people not be punished for it? This abuse, this horrendous act that happened to me, this abuser's walking free with nothing. There's no justice, we may look at it and say, but with God, we understand there is. They may not find justice in this life, but they will with God. God is just. He is a perfect judge. And the one who is guilty will be punished. The one who is righteous will not. Now, one thing I do want to make clear is that does not mean that the righteous sometimes won't suffer for the sins of other people. It doesn't mean that the righteous won't suffer for the sins of other people. For instance, a wayward child who abandons the faith, leaves his family, goes off doing his own thing. God's not going to judge the parents or the children or the spouse as a result of his sin, but that doesn't mean that they won't suffer because of it. It's kind of like, I envision it sometimes with an umbrella, right? You're in the middle of a driving rainstorm. You've got an umbrella, and it's keeping the rain off of you. But if you walk past somebody, that rain's going to hit that umbrella, run off that umbrella, and run onto them. And a lot of times it's that way with our sin. The people that you are around, our sin runs off of us and onto them, where they're not punished by God, but they still face those consequences. The Bible talks about sin being passed down from one generation to another. It's not that God is judging one generation to another, but again, you think about a drunkard father and the impact that that has on those children. And then those children grow up struggling with the sins of their father, which they then, because of their struggles, their children suffer up under them. Or maybe you've got a mother who is super judgmental and critical, and none of her children can ever do anything right. She's always finding wrong things in all of them, and suddenly her children come little perfectionists, doing whatever they can to just appease mom and keep her happy. And then that personality that they build as children, those habits that they formed, they then take into their marriage, which runs off onto their spouse and onto their children. And so our sin, yes, it affects other people. The righteous can be affected by sin. We can face the consequences of sin, but praise the Lord that we will never face the judgment of other people's sin. And before I move on, I do want to point out that by the grace of God, that yes, it is true that our sin affects other people, but our righteousness affects other people as well. The same umbrella example, just as rain may run off and hit other people, so too God's grace upon us. Kind of an odd passage. 1 Corinthians 7. This is about how if there's a couple that's married and one spouse becomes a believer but the other one doesn't, he's saying for the one who's a believer to, as long as the unbeliever is willing to stay married, to stay married. All right? And so then in chapter 7, I'll read verse 13 and 14. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. I struggled with that passage for a long time, wondering what's going on there, because we know that me being saved doesn't mean that everybody else in my family is being saved. And here's what Paul's getting at with this passage, is that if there's one person in that home who's a Christian, and there's one person in that home whom God is blessing and giving his grace to, then inherently the blessing and that grace is going to run off onto the other people in that home. And if the believer leaves that home, then there's nobody in that home receiving the blessing and grace of God. So he's saying stay in there so that God's blessings and his grace can be upon that home, because who knows, maybe as a result of it running off that umbrella, that from the blessings and grace of God upon you, that the others in that house can be saved. So as long as they're willing to live with you, do it. So it's twofold. Our sin affects other people, but also God's grace upon my life affects others as well. But God is just. God is just. We will never be judged for the sins of other people. So we move on to chapter 19. Not only is God just, but God is merciful. And I'd also add to that God is faithful. God is merciful and God is faithful. If you remember back a couple of weeks ago, as I preached in 2 Peter 2, you may remember that Peter 2 different times refers to Lot as righteous. It's referred to as righteous Lot. And as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Well, follow along as I read in chapter 19, because the picture I get from this, I would not describe him righteous. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servants and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Bring them out to us that we may know them. Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Now, I'll pause there. All right. This is kind of an addendum to the sermon, but there's a lot of people in the world today who's trying to twist what's actually going on here. I think all of us understand what's going on. The word know in the Bible is a euphemism for sexual actions. In saying the men wanted to know these three angels who were appearing as men, it meant that they wanted to have sexual intercourse with them. And Lot saying, no, that can't happen. What the world's doing today, because the world wants homosexuality to be okay and they're wanting the church to be okay with it, is they're saying that the three men were just visitors in the town. They were strangers, and the people in the city legitimately wanted to know, who are these men that you have allowed to come in this city? They just generally wanted knowledge to make sure they're safe. That's the way the world's twisting this passage today. But we know that's not true. For one thing, that word know is used in a sexual sense throughout the Old Testament, but also verse 7, Lot says, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. It's not a wicked thing to ensure safety. And so Lot understood what they were wanting to do was evil and immoral. So we must not let the world, well, the world can do whatever they want to do. We have to make sure we don't follow the world in what they're saying. Now, verse 8, I'll get to this mess in a second. I'll just read and then hit this later on. But Lot says, behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, stand back. And they said, this fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in this city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against his people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went up and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 brothers by the hand, and the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. He said to him, behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there. Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. So Peter refers to Lot as righteous, but we read this, and we know even before now that God had given his promise and his covenant to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, that God was going to bless the world through Abraham. And what did Lot want to do? He wanted to separate himself from Abraham. Lot willingly separated himself not only from Abraham, but from the promise that was given to Abraham. And not only that, he went and chose to live in one of the most wicked cities in all the world. As we read now, Lot continues to live in this incredibly wicked city. He didn't say, oh, this didn't turn out how it was supposed to. I need to go back to Abraham. He continues living there. He then strangely offers his daughters to the rapist and offering for them to gang rape his 2 daughters. In verse 16, as the angels pull him back in and they're warning, this is about to happen. Get your family and get your tails out of here. He was lingering, like my children trying to find their shoes, or me sitting in the van wondering where Aiden is. I don't know. She got distracted and forgot we were leaving. Who knows where, somebody go find Aiden. Who knows where she is? They're just lingering. To the point that for Lot to get out, the angels had to seize them and take them out. They didn't run on their own. The angels had to seize them and take them out. His sons-in-law and daughters and wife did not seem to be faithful because they didn't listen to the angels. He most likely married a wife from Sodom. God told him to escape to the hills, not the valley, yet because the hills were so far away, Lot thought he would die getting to the hills. So Lot wanted to go to the valley, exactly where God told him not to go, and begged to spare the city of Zoar so he doesn't have to go to where God said it was safe to go. Then after God rescues him, he twice gets drunk. He gets raped by his 2 daughters, impregnates them while drunk. If I was preaching his funeral, I'm not sure that I would refer to him as righteous Lot. And yet he does. We just continue in this, looking at this weird situation with his daughters. Why in the world would a man offer his daughters? These answers, he was sinful, but to dig more into that is that we have to understand the culture is that it was a massive custom at that time that you are hospitable to your guest and that you meet all the needs of your guest. Regularly, when we read the Bible, somebody shows up at the door, whether they're expected or unexpected, like you go kill a fattened calf and like the wife cooks like this nice fancy feast, which I've thought all the time, like, I hope they're not hungry because this isn't like waiting for your wife to get something out of the refrigerator. It's like, hey, honey, go kill the calf. Like you're starting, from like literally from scratch. Like that's going to be a long time. But regularly they come in and you have to be a good host. And so to allow somebody to come to your house and then allow them to be attacked and injured would be a massive and a major cultural taboo. Yet that makes no excuse for him offering up his daughters. Apparently, Lot's fear of man, both the physical fear of man and the fear of man in regards to his reputation, what will they think of me, led him to this sin, this unthinkable sin. He was more concerned with being well thought of than he was with being a father. That's unfathomable. And yet that's what sin does to us. But here's the deal. In light of all of that, God saved him. In light of all of that, God saved him. For us, it's like, let the joker burn. If you're going to offer up your daughters like that, let him burn. And God saved him. Listen, our salvation is not based off of our works, but off the works of Christ. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no man may boast. Paul wrote to Timothy, though we are faithless, he remains faithful. God is merciful and God is faithful. Now, how can Peter refer to him as righteous Lot? Because of what Christ would eventually do upon the cross. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of Christ. To where we are no longer characterized by our sin and identified by our sin, but rather identified by the righteousness of Christ. God is merciful and God is faithful. Verses 23 through 29 God is wrathful. God is wrathful. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and towards all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now, I meant to add verse 29 to the last section about God being merciful and God being faithful. Again, God saved Lot not only out of his own mercy, but out of his faithfulness to Abraham. He had told Abraham, I'll save Lot. And so, though Lot was not deserving to be saved, God remembered his promise. And God fulfilled that promise that he made to Abraham. And he saved a man who was undeserving of being saved because he is faithful. But the point being now, God is wrathful. I preached a whole sermon on this 2 Sundays ago because Peter references it in 2 Peter. So not to hit too much on this, but Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed for man to die once, and then comes the judgment. As we look at 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction. There was a purpose in this, not only in bringing judgment for their sin, but remember, he's teaching Abraham about his righteousness and justice because it's Abraham's job to teach the generations after them so that all the nations of the world can know God. Now listen to why he did this in verse 6, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly. Abraham, you need to know me so that you can rightly teach everybody. Here is me. Yes, I'm a merciful and faithful God, but I'm also a wrathful God. And this is what is going to happen to everyone who rejects me. To everyone. This is an example. But to end on a good note, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. This is an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly, but Lot is an example of what's going to happen to those who are under the covenant of God through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Fourth is that God's ways are best. God's ways are best. Going back to Genesis, verses 30 through 38, this is the story of, again, his daughters. Verse 30, now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. Remember, his 2 daughters, they were engaged or betrothed to be married. So they were still virgins. They had no children, and there was going to be no lineage. They wanted children. And so they justified their sins. Some of you in my Sunday night class, we've been talking about this. There's something we want to do. We feel guilty about it. So if I can change the way I think about it, then I'll change my feelings, which then allows me to do it. They desired children. They knew it was wrong, so they then justified it. Is that it's not about us. We want to carry on our father's lineage. We're concerned about his lineage and his reputation. So we're going to give him children. You're concerned about his reputation. So you're going to get your dad drunk and rape him and have your child/grandchild? Like, that concern was not about Lot. That concern was about themselves. And so they justified their sin with their minds. But turning back to Lot, in verse 30, It said that Lot lived in a cave because he was afraid to live in Zoar. We find another decision of Lot not working out. As long as we've known Lot, Lot has made the wrong decisions. Instead of following the commands of God, Lot had become compromised and had a history of not doing what God said. He separated himself from Abraham and the promise. He took a wife from Sodom. Lot had become comfortable in his sin. Think about this story when he offered up his daughters. He goes outside to the men of the city, and he calls the men of the city brothers. Called the men of the city brothers. Hey guys, I'm one of you, right? Hey, we're all in this together. Hey brothers, hey friends, buddies. What do you think about this? He goes outside and he calls them brothers and he tries to reason with them. Ephesians 5:11 and 12 says, "Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, for it is shameful even to speak of the evil things that they do." And Lot was comfortable in such wickedness to the point of calling them brothers. Lot was compromised. A righteous man compromised. Then we look at this story of Zoar. God told him to run to the hills, but he says, I can't do it. God, I can't make, you see how far that is? I'll die before I get there. How many times have we told God, God, I can't do what you've told me? The times that I've heard this the most is when there's two people who are on the brink of divorce and they won't divorce because they're so miserable at home, they think by disobeying God again that will make their life better. And so the reasoning is that if I can just escape this conflict, that things will get better. And so I'll point out to them, I acknowledge there are some exceptions to where God says it's okay to get divorced. So I'm talking about those to where it's not. And I'll point out, God doesn't give you a right to get divorced. God expects you to stay together and work through this. And regularly I will hear, I cannot live in this anymore. I cannot live with him anymore. It is too hard. I'm tired of it. I can't do it. Every time I promise them, it will be more difficult for you to willingly disobey the Lord than to stay in that marriage and work through it. God's ways are always best. Lot told God, I can't go there. Instead of bringing judgment on all the cities, he found the smallest city. Found the smallest city and said, this is just a puny, tiny city. You can ignore their sin and let me live there. Again, he chooses to live in a city that God said was so sinful, I need to destroy. He chose again to live in sin because obedience was too hard for him. And then he gets there and immediately finds out, this wasn't the best decision because these people are really wicked. He was so scared of the people there that he was living in a cave. This is another proof of Lot's small view of sin. That he's okay. He's already seen God destroy, or God's about to destroy. He knows it's about to happen, and he again goes and lives in sin. But God allows it, spares that. But as Lot lives there, not only is he scared and living in a cave, but now this mess with his daughters. His sin and his sinful choices not only affected himself, but the runoff is now his daughters. His daughters not only, I guess thinking back before that, is that Lot was willing to allow his daughters to be sexually abused, and now the tables have turned. Now his daughters are sexually abusing him. And then what they named their children, the oldest daughter names her child Moab, which means from father. That's precious. And then the younger daughter names her child Ben Ami, which means son of my people, which means son of my relative. Apparently, neither daughter was ashamed of her actions and was brazen in their sin to the point of naming their sons after their sin. The Lord continuously requested different things, or Lot kept requesting different things than what the Lord commanded. Sometimes the Lord lets us have what we're desiring. Sometimes we seek after sin enough. The Lord says, okay, have it. Have it. Let's see how living in Zoar works out for you, Lot. You haven't learned your lesson yet? I'll spare it. Lot, go there. Sometimes we seek after sin enough, God gives it to us. And inevitably, what's going to happen is we're going to very quickly remember that God's ways are best. Regardless of how difficult they may be, disobeying Him will always be more difficult in the long run. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. But later on, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. You think about Hebrews 11, the chapter before that, that's Hebrews 12. Hebrews 11, speaking about Moses, and Moses choosing not to live in Egypt, but rather living with the people of Israel. It said that he rejected the fleeting pleasures of sin. Sin brings enjoyment now, but later on brings difficulty. Obedience may be difficult now, but later on brings pleasure. Proverbs 13:15 says this, the way of a sinner is their ruin. The way of a sinner is their ruin, or the way of a sinner is ruinous. Sin brings difficulty. Sin brings pain. Sin brings complications, not just for ourselves. With that umbrella analogy, it's going to run off onto other people. And so God wanted Abraham to learn about his righteousness and justice because he's going to be the father of many nations. And he had to learn about it. He was going to learn that God is just. He's going to learn that God is merciful. Yet though he's merciful, God is also wrathful, and that God's ways are best. God is infinitely wise and infinitely knowledgeable, and thus he is infinitely trustworthy. And regardless of how difficult life gets, we can trust him. And when we blow it, inevitably, hopefully not as bad as Lot, but when we blow it, we remember that God is merciful. So those of you who joined us at home, we appreciate you joining us. We're going to turn now to our time of prayer.